And yes, as Sue said, how basically how I got involved in working with climate change does have to do with too much manure being in the river where we baptize people. It's the Elkhart River. We started this about 17 years ago, and as we realized that there's this problem, we started getting involved in something called Hoosier River Watch, something where we get into the water times a year. It's a citizen science kind of project. And so we learn more about the science of our river and what makes for a healthy river and what we can do about it. But this also got me to start reading the Bible differently and to ask questions of the Bible that I hadn't been asking, and to notice what rivers, how they functioned in the Bible, and to start to realize that creation is not just some scenic background in the Bible, but is also a participant with God in the creation and salvation story. And that's what led me to the University of Toronto. And then it was 2 years ago that I was invited to be part of the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. Luke Gasho and Jennifer Schrock asked me to be the director of Pastoral Ecology. And so I've led about 7 retreats now of pastors throughout the continent, both in the US and Canada. It's about 150 pastors and leaders. These are photos of the ones in Los Angeles, near New York City, and in Oregon. And so I think we've reached about 15% of MCUSA congregations through these. And kind of my question, as I've looked at the climate crisis, is what is the pastoral role connected with climate change? What can we do as pastors? What can we do as congregations in our communities? And I've focused on more of the psychological and spiritual aspects and moral aspects of the climate crisis. And so looking at the psychology, part of what has intrigued me is this psychological paradox of climate change, that as the climate science has become more convincing, people have become less certain. Either they believe the science or they don't act on it. And this is something that's been going on for about 25 years. It finally started to change. This decline in interest started to decline in 2016, so that today 72% of Americans say that global warming is important to them personally. And this is up 16 points since 2015. But even with this shift that there is more interest, if we look at people's policy priorities for last year, if you look at this graphic, climate change is almost at the very bottom. It's 17 out of 18 of policy priorities. But for the last half year, I've been telling people, when I show this graphic, I've been saying, I think this is finally changing. I think it's going to go up. And so this is a survey that the Pew Research Center does every January. And so finally, 10 days ago, the new one came out. And they do a little bit of a different graphic, but the big news here is that climate change finally is a higher priority for people. It's gone from the very bottom, or almost the very bottom, to the middle. It's gone to 11 out of 18. I would still like to see it higher. Interestingly, the environment is now also moved from the middle to the top. The economy is not the biggest policy concern. Now, the graphics are a little bit different, and what I want to mention there, they wanted to show this year just how partisan and polarized we are on these issues. And so what the blue is what Democrats and Democratic-leaning people are saying, and the red is Republicans and Republican-leaning. And so one other thing to note is that climate change is the most politically polarized of all the issues on here. It's more polarized than gun policy. It's more polarized than immigration. So that's becoming an issue that I'm realizing I need to be looking at a little bit more. But just the question of the politicization of it. I want to go back to this psychological element of climate and thinking about how we talk about denial, because we often talk about denial in terms of American conservatives who blatantly deny climate change is happening, who say that it's not they disbelieve the science. But when Kari Norgard spent a year in a small town in Norway about 20 years ago now, it was the warmest winter in 130 years, And she noticed that people didn't talk about climate change, even though Norwegians love winter, they love the wilderness, they're social justice advocates, they're environmental advocates. They um, there's all these reasons why you would think they would be talking about it. They believe the science. It's not that they disbelieve the science, but for them it brought up a whole host of these negative emotions. And in particular for them, they're a wealthy country, and a lot of that wealth comes from their oil reserves in the North Sea. And so there also was this dissonance in their identity. So not talking about climate change was a way of protecting themselves from troubling emotions. And so she identified three types of denial that people use to help manage things like climate change. The first kind of denial is literal denial. It's blatant, factual denial. And an example of this would be someone who denies that the Holocaust happened. It's just blatant. Interpretive denial is a little step removed. The facts aren't denied, but they're given a different interpretation than what you would expect them to have. It's not that nothing happened, it's just that what you think happened isn't really what happened. And so someone might say something like, I'm a social drinker, not an alcoholic. And so for climate, it would be something like saying it's not a serious threat, or that it's not caused by emissions, by carbon emissions. And then finally, there's implicatory denial. And I think that this is the kind of denial that's actually the biggest denial that's used when it comes to climate change. It's not that the facts are denied. It's not that they're given an unconventional interpretation. It's just that the moral, psychological, political, and moral implications are ignored. And an example of this would be if we see someone getting mugged and we decide not to intervene, and there, we rationalize that it's probably dangerous to intervene, but we also aren't doing the right thing in a way. So it's this third kind of denial that's the most complicated and the most prevalent, and it protects us from emotions like helplessness, guilt, fear, and at the bottom, I think it protects us from despair. Now, denial is not a new thing. We see it in the biblical tradition and among the prophets. Isaiah 6 is this powerful passage, the calling of Isaiah. The first part of this chapter is this beautiful image of God in the temple, and Isaiah volunteering to become God's prophet. And when Isaiah asks what to say, we get this difficult kind of message. God says to Isaiah, go and say to this people, listen continuously, but do not discern. Look continuously, but do not understand. Make fat the mind of this people, and its ears make heavy, and its eyes make blind, lest it see with its eyes, and with its ears hear, and its mind discern, and it turn and be healed. Isaiah asks, how long? And God replies, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate. And so clearly Isaiah experienced denial in his ministry. This passage also reminds us that of this connection between humans and the land, because it's the land that has to be emptied of people before God will reverse the decision to actually help them become discerning people again. So Isaiah experienced denial. Martin Luther King Jr. also experienced implicatory denial in the civil rights movement. His famous letter from a Birmingham jail is not addressed to outright racists. It's addressed to white moderates who are telling him that he is that he's being too pushy, that he's moving too fast with things. And so he wrote in that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. And he partly saw that one of the things he was fighting against is this idea that things will get better in the future, kind of no matter what. And so he says, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. So my work has been asking then how can our congregations and how can we in our pastoral roles help people to confront this implicatory denial, and these are the primary three areas that I think about, and where I think congregations in particular have a special role to play in helping our society to address climate change. And one aspect of this is the fact that as congregations we are a social entity. We have a bigger influence because we are a gathering of people. We're not just individuals, and we can be places. The best way to fight denial is to actually be places where we speak about the thing that's being denied, and so to have communal conversations that are gracious yet difficult at times, and to be places where people can come on a regular basis and talk about what's going on, talk about the ways that we're trying to change our lifestyle, talk about ways that we're trying to engage broader society, but also just to be a place where climate change is talked about in our sermons, it's talked about in our prayers, that as we pray for natural disasters, that we might include a confession for the ways that our carbon emissions have contributed to some of these destructive kinds of things. And then another kind of resource that we have as congregations is our ritual traditions, our worship, and that we actually have rituals around lament and grief that help to provoke hope. We call these funerals, and that's when we do this the most often. I think what we need to do when it comes to climate change is to come up with ways of grieving in the midst of ecological losses. And that's part of the wording here, from disenfranchised grief to acknowledged grief. Disenfranchised grief are griefs where there isn't a social norms around how to respond to those griefs, things like miscarriages and that kind of thing. And so ecological grief, if we can in our churches start naming our griefs and our laments, it can help us, I think, to move towards a hopeful response. And then finally, I'm just realizing more and more that we need to be places that are advocating for climate justice. And Christy and Sibonokule are going to talk about this, but the people who've contributed the least to the climate crisis are the ones who often suffer the most, both in the US and internationally. And so churches need to help give voice to those who are already and have been for many years experiencing the climate crisis, and to work towards changing things in our society. So I think I will now go ahead and introduce I think I'll introduce the rest of the panel. Is that, I think that maybe makes sense. And then I don't have to fall in between here. Oh, I did have one other, I wanted to end with a kind of reversal of denial, or like God's call in Isaiah 42. Says, I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness to open the eyes of the blind, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison. So I want us to be thinking about how we as churches can open our eyes to the climate crisis. Okay, so Dr. Christy Miller-Hesed is our next speaker. She's from Heston, Kansas. She's an environmental anthropologist and was director of Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience, a project that brought together rural African American church communities with county and state governments and with environmental NGOs to address climate change on the Chesapeake Bay.